Hello there, and welcome back to Chronicle Keepers. If this is your first time here, you've found a quiet space where history unfolds gently, perfect for the late hours when sleep is on its way. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim those lights, adjust your blankets, maybe turn on a fan, or find that perfect position where everything feels just right. There's no rush here. Now, let's talk about something that unites humanity across all cultures, all centuries, all corners of the globe. Taxes. Benjamin Franklin once said that nothing is certain except death and taxes. But he left out the third certainty, humanity's eternal resentment of both. You might think taxes are a modern annoyance, something invented by governments with too many spreadsheets and not enough sympathy. But no, taxes are ancient, almost as old as civilization itself. As soon as humans figured out how to build cities, they figured out how to demand a cut of the harvest. If you enjoy these late-night journeys through history, I genuinely appreciate a like or subscribe, but only if it feels right. And I'm curious tonight, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop a comment below. I love knowing which corners of the world these stories reach. Congratulations, you're about to learn that your ancestors have been complaining about taxes for at least 5,000 years. Turns out, you come by it honestly. To find the beginning of taxes, we need to travel back, far back, to a time before coins existed, before paper money was dreamed of, before anyone had a wallet to empty. We're going to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Modern-day Iraq, around 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago. This is where civilization itself began. And apparently, so did the tax collector. Picture the world's first cities rising from the desert. Uruk, Lagash. Names that sound like whispers from an impossibly distant past. These weren't small villages. Uruk, at its height, may have held 40,000 people. A true city, with walls and temples and markets, and all the complexity that comes with humans living together in large numbers. And here's the thing about cities. They cost money. Well, not money exactly, not yet, but they cost something. Who builds the walls that keep invaders out? Who digs the canals that bring water to the fields? Who constructs the great ziggurats, those massive step temples reaching toward the heavens? Someone has to pay for all of it. And that someone was everyone. The moment humans stopped wandering and settled down, the moment they built permanent structures and created governments, the question arose, how do we fund this? The answer was taxation. It's been the answer ever since. Now, the Sumerians didn't pay taxes in dollars or coins. Coins hadn't been invented yet. That was still 2,000 years in the future. So what did they pay with? Grain, mostly, barley, and wheat. The staff of life in ancient Mesopotamia. When harvest time came, a portion of what you grew belonged to the temple, to the palace, to the state. Livestock too, sheep and goats and cattle. The tax assessor would count your flock, and some percentage belonged to the authorities. Not metaphorically, actually belonged. They would take them. Dates from the palm trees, fish from the rivers, oil pressed from sesame seeds. Whatever you produced, whatever you harvested, whatever you pulled from the earth or the water, some of it was owed. And then there was labor. Corvée labor, historians call it. Forced work on public projects. You might owe the state not just your grain, but your body, your time, weeks or months spent digging canals, building walls, hauling bricks for temples. If you wanted to fish in certain waters, you paid for the privilege. If you wanted to graze your animals on certain lands, you paid. If you wanted water from the irrigation canals, and you desperately did, because without water nothing grew, you paid. Everything was taxed. Everything was counted. Everything was owed. The system was remarkably sophisticated for being the first of its kind. Temple priests managed most of it. In ancient Sumer, there wasn't a clear line between religion and government. The temple was the center of economic life. The priests were bureaucrats. The bureaucrats were priests. They needed to track who owed what, who had paid, who hadn't, and so they invented something remarkable: writing. Well, perhaps they didn't invent writing for taxes specifically, but taxes were certainly one of the first things they wrote about. Cuneiform, those distinctive wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay. The earliest written records we have from human civilization include tax receipts, inventories, lists of who owed how many bushels of barley. These clay tablets have survived 5,000 years. You can see them in museums today. Humanity's first paperwork, and it was, inevitably, about taxes. Tax rates varied, but something in the range of 10 to 20% of your produce was typical. 1/10 to 1/5 of everything you grew, raised, or caught. Payment schedules followed the harvest. When the grain came in, the tax came due. When the sheep gave birth and the flock grew, the assessment followed. It was all very organized, very systematic, very inescapable. To run this system, you needed people who could read and write, scribes, trained specialists who understood cuneiform, who could make marks on clay, who could calculate and record and remember. These scribes wielded enormous power. Think about it. If you're a farmer, you can't read. Almost no one could read. The scribe shows up at your farm, counts your grain, makes marks on a tablet, and tells you what you owe. How do you know he's being honest? You don't. Not really. You have to trust him, or fear him, or both. Knowledge was power in ancient Mesopotamia, and the knowledge of reading and writing and calculating, that was concentrated in the hands of the temple bureaucracy. The process worked something like this. Assessors would travel to farms and estates. They would count the sheep, measure the grain stores, estimate the harvest. Everything was recorded. Then the collection would happen. Sometimes the tax collector taking goods directly, sometimes the farmer delivering what was owed to the temple granaries. Corruption was already a problem. We have records, ancient complaints carved in clay, about dishonest officials, about assessors who overestimated harvests, about collectors who took more than was owed, about bribes and favoritism, and all the petty corruptions that follow whenever someone has power over someone else. 5,000 years ago, and people were already complaining about corrupt tax collectors. Some things truly never change. But let's be fair to the ancient Sumerians. They weren't taxing people just for the pleasure of taking their grain. They had genuine needs, irrigation first and foremost. Mesopotamia means land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers flooded unpredictably. The land was fertile, but only if you could control the water. Bring it to the fields when needed. Drain it away when it threatened to drown the crops. This required canals, massive public works, dikes and channels and reservoirs. No individual farmer could build these. It required coordination, labor, resources, taxation. Without the irrigation systems, everyone died. It was that simple. The taxes that funded those canals were, quite literally, the price of survival. Armies were necessary too. Other city-states existed, other peoples beyond the rivers. Conflict was constant. Walls needed building, soldiers needed feeding, weapons needed forging. And then there were the temples, those great ziggurats rising above the flat landscape, monuments to the gods, centers of religious and economic life. The priests who ran these temples didn't farm. They administered. They performed rituals. They kept records. They needed to eat, and that food came from the taxes of those who worked the land. Roads, walls, granaries for storing surplus against famine, courts for settling disputes, all the infrastructure of civilization. It all cost something. And that something came from taxes. In theory, this was fair, a social contract, though no one called it that. You pay your taxes. In return, you get irrigation that lets your crops grow, walls that protect you from invaders, priests who intercede with the gods on your behalf, order and stability and civilization itself. In practice, well, in practice, you paid your taxes because if you didn't, bad things happened. The temple had power. The palace had soldiers. If you refused to pay, they could take your property, force you into labor, imprison you. Worse. The social contract was real, but it wasn't exactly voluntary. You participated because you had no choice, because the alternative was punishment. This tension between taxation as a fair exchange for services and taxation as coerced extraction, it's been with us from the very beginning. Every civilization since has wrestled with the same question. What do we owe each other? What can the state legitimately demand? When does taxation become tyranny? The Sumerians didn't resolve these questions, neither have we. And where there are taxes, there is tax resistance. Even in ancient Mesopotamia, people tried to avoid paying. Farmers hid grain. They'd store it in secret places, hoping the assessor wouldn't find it. Underground pits, hidden rooms, anywhere the tax collector's eyes might not reach. Shepherds underreported livestock. Oh, these sheep? Only 20, definitely not 30. That lamb? It died. Very tragic. We have clay tablets recording disputes between farmers and tax collectors, complaints about excessive assessments, appeals to higher authorities. The ancient equivalent of, "I'd like to speak to your manager." Punishments for tax evasion were severe. Confiscation of property, forced labor on public works, the very projects your taxes would have funded anyway. But now, you're doing it for free, while also losing your freedom. Imprisonment, public humiliation. The state had limited patience for those who didn't pay, and yet people still tried. The calculation must have seemed worth it. Maybe you'd get caught. Maybe you wouldn't. Either way, that grain hidden under the floor was grain in your belly, not the temple's granary. The eternal dance between tax collectors and tax evaders, it starts right here, in the mud brick cities of ancient Sumer. What does it mean that taxation is this old? It means that from the very first moment humans built something we'd recognize as civilization, taxation was part of it. Not a corruption of some earlier, purer state, not a modern invention, but present from the beginning. Cities require cooperation on a scale that voluntary contribution can't achieve. Someone has to decide what gets built, who does the work, how resources are allocated, and that someone needs resources to work with. The Sumerians figured this out 5,000 years ago. Every civilization since has confirmed it. Taxes are the price of civilization, or at least, no one's found a way to have one without the other. And for just as long, people have grumbled about it. Too much taxation. Money wasted on projects that benefit others. corrupt collectors taking more than their share, officials living well while farmers struggle. These complaints echo across millennia. Sumerian farmers hiding grain, American colonists dumping tea, you sighing at your tax bill. Same frustration, different eras. But Mesopotamia was just the beginning. Every civilization that rose after them had to figure out the same problem. How do you make people give you their stuff? We've just explored humanity's first experiments with taxation, the temple granaries of Mesopotamia, the careful accounting of Sumerian scribes pressing reeds into wet clay. But if Mesopotamia invented taxation, Egypt perfected it. For over 3,000 years, the civilization along the Nile operated one of the most sophisticated tax systems the ancient world would ever see, a system that built monuments still standing today, a system so effective it created perhaps the most stable civilization in human history. It was also a system of absolute divine authority, meticulous record-keeping, and, when necessary, brutal enforcement. Let's journey to the banks of the Nile, where paying your taxes wasn't just a civic duty, it was an act of worship. Picture Egypt around 3000 BCE. The two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, have recently unified under a single ruler, the pharaoh. And here's the first thing you need to understand about Egyptian taxation. It wasn't really taxation at all. Not in the way we think of it. The pharaoh owned everything. The land, pharaohs, the river, pharaohs. The grain growing in the fields, the cattle grazing on the banks, the fish swimming in the waters, all pharaohs. You didn't own your farm. You worked pharaoh's land. When you gave a portion of your harvest to the state, you weren't paying taxes. You were returning to the divine ruler what was already his. This wasn't just legal theory. It was theology. The pharaoh was a living god, the incarnation of Horus on earth, the intermediary between humanity and the divine forces that made the Nile flood, the crops grow, the sun rise each morning. When you gave your grain to Pharaoh's collectors, you were participating in the cosmic order. You were maintaining Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of truth, justice, and harmony that kept the universe functioning. Refused to pay? You weren't just breaking the law, you were disrupting the very fabric of reality. You were inviting chaos into the world. Try that logic on your modern tax authority. The genius of this system was that it transformed taxation from a transaction into a sacred obligation. The pharaoh didn't need to justify what he took. He was God. Gods don't negotiate. So what exactly did Egyptians owe to their divine ruler? Primarily, grain. Wheat and barley were the foundation of the Egyptian economy and the Egyptian tax system. Farmers surrendered a portion of each harvest, typically around 10 to 20%, though rates varied by era and circumstance. This grain flowed into massive royal granaries, architectural marvels in their own right. Some could hold enough grain to feed entire cities for months. The state accumulated vast reserves, insurance against the inevitable years when the Nile failed to rise. But grain wasn't the only levy. Livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs. Fishermen owed fish. Fowlers owed birds. Craftsmen might owe a portion of their production, pottery, textiles, jewelry. Those with access to precious materials paid in kind. Gold from Nubian mines, copper from Sinai, lapis lazuli traded from distant lands. And then there was the most personal tax of all, labor. The corvée system required every Egyptian man to give a certain number of days each year to state projects. This wasn't slavery. These were taxpayers fulfilling their obligations. And here's something that might surprise you. The pyramids weren't built by slaves. They were built by taxpayers. Egyptian workers, farmers mostly, serving their labor obligation to the state. We have their villages, their bakeries, their medical facilities. They were fed, housed, and, apparently, sometimes given beer rations. They were still building monuments they'd never use for a god king who'd be buried inside. But they weren't slaves. They were just doing their taxes. Here's where Egyptian taxation becomes genuinely sophisticated. The Nile flooded every year. Without it, nothing grew. With it, the fields turned black with rich silt, and harvests were abundant. But the flood varied. Some years, the waters rose high and spread far. Other years, they barely topped the banks. The Egyptians needed to know how high the flood would reach, not just for farming, but for taxes. Enter the Nilometer. These were structures built along the river, stairs descending into the water, or vertical columns marked with measurements or wells connected to the Nile that registered its level. Officials monitored the Nilometer throughout the flood season. They recorded the maximum height. They calculated what it meant for the coming harvest. High flood, rich harvest coming. Taxes would be set accordingly. High, because farmers would have plenty to give. Low flood, poor harvest ahead. Taxes reduced because extracting too much would cause starvation. This was remarkably sophisticated for the ancient world. A variable tax rate adjusted annually based on actual economic conditions. The Egyptians had invented something like a GDP-linked tax system 3,000 years before economists gave it a name. Of course, reduced taxes during famine years still meant taxes. Pharaoh still got his share. People still went hungry. But the principle that tax burden should reflect capacity to pay was revolutionary, and the Nilometer made it possible. You cannot run a system this complex without bureaucracy. And Egyptian bureaucracy was extraordinary. Scribes were everywhere, every transaction recorded, every field measured, every grain counted. The literacy required to become a scribe took years of training. But the rewards were substantial. Scribes didn't do manual labor. They didn't serve in the corvée. A famous Egyptian text advises students, be a scribe. Your limbs will be sleek, your hands soft. You will go forth in white clothes, honored, with courtiers saluting you. Not a bad career pitch. These scribes formed the backbone of tax administration. They maintained census records. Who lived where? Who owned what? They tracked livestock counts. They documented harvests year after year, building databases on papyrus that let officials spot discrepancies. The most important annual ritual was the stretching of the cord. After each year's flood receded, survey teams spread across Egypt. They carried measuring ropes, the cords standardized to precise lengths. Field by field, they remeasured the cultivable land. Why remeasure every year? Because the flood reshaped everything. Boundaries shifted. Some fields gained silt, grew larger, others eroded. The annual survey ensured taxes matched current reality. Imagine teams of officials walking the fields with their ropes, their scribes trailing behind with papyrus and ink, documenting every measurement. Then imagine this happening across the entire length of the Nile Valley for 3,000 years. We have some of these records, papyri that survived in Egypt's dry climate. Line after line of fields, owners, measurements, assessments. The ancient world's equivalent of a tax database, written by hand, preserved by accident. The scale of it is staggering, and it worked. Once assessments were complete, collection began. Government officials toured their districts, typically after harvest when grain was available. They arrived with scribes, measuring tools, and, when necessary, armed guards. The process was methodical. Officials would measure your granary, count your cattle, inspect your production, compare what you had against what records said you should have. Then they took Pharaoh's share. The grain went into royal storage facilities, massive buildings with thick walls to keep contents cool and protected from pests. From there, it flowed to wherever the state needed it, feeding workers on construction projects, supplying the army, supporting the priesthood, trading with foreign powers. For livestock, the process was similar. Animals were counted, marked, and a portion taken. Fish were dried and stored. Craftwork was catalogued and claimed. Everything was recorded. Multiple copies of records kept in multiple locations. The Egyptians understood that documentation was power. The tax collector's visit wasn't pleasant. It never is. But it was predictable, systematic, and, by ancient standards, relatively fair. Unless, of course, you couldn't pay. Egyptian tomb paintings are famous for their beautiful depictions of daily life, farming, fishing, feasting, worship. They also show tax collection, including what happened when people couldn't or wouldn't pay. The images are striking. A taxpayer bent over, held by officials, while another official raises a rod to beat him. The expression on the victim's face, even in stylized Egyptian art, conveys distress. These weren't abstract warnings, they were documentation of actual practice. Beatings were the first resort. If you couldn't produce the expected grain, you might be whipped until you revealed where you'd hidden it, or until officials accepted you truly had nothing. Beyond beatings, confiscation. Whatever property you had could be seized. Your remaining grain, your animals, your tools, everything taken until the debt was satisfied. Still not enough? Forced labor. You'd work off your tax debt on state projects. Indefinitely in some cases. Your family could be held responsible. If you fled, your relatives might be punished until you returned, or your debt was paid. Imprisonment existed, though evidence is thinner. But the message was clear. You could not escape Pharaoh's share. The tomb paintings that show these beatings weren't hidden. They were displayed. They were reminders. Pay your taxes. Or else, of course, people tried to avoid paying. Some things never change. Farmers underreported yields. They'd claim the harvest was poorer than it actually was, hoping assessors wouldn't catch the discrepancy. Others hid grain before officials arrived, buried in pits, concealed in false walls, moved to relatives' properties. Bribing local officials was common. The scribes who assessed your fields, the collectors who measured your granary. A small gift might lead to a smaller assessment. Falsifying land measurements happened too. Moving boundary markers, claiming fields were smaller than they were, hoping the surveying team wouldn't notice. We know about these tricks because Egyptian records complain about them. Official documents warn against corrupt scribes. Legal texts describe punishments for fraudulent reporting. The cat-and-mouse game between taxpayer and collector is as old as taxation itself. The Egyptians played it for 3 millennia. Some evaders were caught and punished. Others succeeded. The system absorbed a certain amount of leakage. No tax system achieves 100% compliance. But the Egyptian system came closer than most. Because the bureaucracy was vast, the records were meticulous, and the consequences for getting caught were severe. Where did all this grain and labor and livestock go? Everywhere. The most visible use? Construction. Temples that still inspire awe. Pyramids that have endured millennia. Monuments, palaces, tombs, statues. The physical legacy of Egypt was built by taxation. The military consumed enormous resources. Soldiers needed feeding. Weapons needed forging. Campaigns into Nubia, Libya, the Levant, all funded by the granaries. The priesthood, nearly as powerful as the pharaoh in some eras, required constant support. Temples employed thousands. Rituals required offerings. The gods, like the state, took their share. The bureaucracy itself consumed resources. Those armies of scribes needed feeding, housing, compensating. Administration has never been free. But here's something remarkable. The state granaries also redistributed. When famine struck, and it struck regularly, the reserves accumulated in good years fed people in bad years. The same system that extracted wealth also provided insurance. Workers on royal projects received rations from state stores. When harvests failed, emergency distributions prevented total collapse. Egyptian taxation was extractive, but it was also redistributive. The pharaoh took, but the pharaoh also gave back, at least enough to keep the system functioning. Here's the strange truth about Egyptian taxation. It was oppressive. Ordinary Egyptians had no say in what they paid. They worked land they didn't own, surrendered harvests they'd labored to grow, gave their bodies to projects they'd never benefit from. And yet, Egypt was one of the most stable civilizations in human history. 3,000 years of continuous culture. Dynasties rose and fell, but the system persisted. The infrastructure those taxes funded, irrigation canals, flood control, granaries, kept people alive. The redistribution during famines prevented the total collapse that destroyed other ancient societies. People still didn't like paying taxes. The tomb paintings make that clear. But they understood, perhaps, that the system, for all its burdens, worked. Oppression and stability, extraction and survival. The paradox of the pharaoh's share. 3,000 years of meticulous record-keeping. Variable rates tied to the Nile's mood. Labor taxes that built wonders still standing. Beatings for those who couldn't pay, and granaries that kept civilization alive when the floods failed. Egyptian taxation was sophisticated, brutal, sacred, and effective all at once. But Egypt, for all its longevity, remained focused inward, concentrated along the Nile, extracting wealth from farmers to build monuments to gods. Another civilization would take a different approach. They wouldn't just tax their own people. They'd conquer an empire and figure out how to tax everyone. While Egypt perfected the art of taxing farmers, Rome was about to turn taxation into an empire-building machine. That story is next. From the mud-brick cities of Mesopotamia, we travel now to marble halls and conquered provinces, to an empire that stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt, to Rome. And Rome, perhaps more than any civilization before or since, understood a fundamental truth. Empires run on taxes. When we think of Rome, we think of legions, gladiators, emperors in purple robes, aqueducts and roads, and the grandeur of the Forum. But beneath all that glory was something less romantic, but far more essential. A tax collection system of breathtaking scale. Rome didn't just conquer territory, it conquered taxpayers. Every province absorbed into the empire wasn't just land on a map, it was revenue, people who could be counted, assessed, and taxed. At its height, the Roman Empire collected taxes from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast, from the shores of Spain to the deserts of Syria. Millions of people across 3 continents, all contributing to the imperial treasury. The Roman Empire was, fundamentally, a tax extraction system backed by military force. That sounds cynical, but it's not entirely unfair. The legions that conquered new lands were expensive. They needed payment. The only way to pay them was to tax the lands they'd already conquered, which required more legions, which required more taxes, which required more conquest. The machine fed itself, growing ever larger, ever more dependent on the constant flow of revenue from every corner of the known world. The Romans didn't have just one tax, they had many, a sophisticated web of levies designed to extract wealth from every possible source. The tributum was the most important, a direct tax on land and people in the provinces. If you lived in a conquered territory, you paid tributum. How much depended on how much land you owned, how many people lived in your household, what you produced. Portoria were customs duties. Goods crossing provincial borders paid taxes. Imports into Italy paid more. The Roman economy was vast and trade-dependent, and every merchant ship, every caravan, every cart of goods generated revenue as it moved. Augustus, the first emperor, introduced an inheritance tax, 5% on estates passed from the dead to their heirs. Romans grumbled about it. Death and taxes combined into one insult, but they paid. Slaves were taxed when sold. Freed slaves paid a tax on their manumission. Even gaining your freedom came with a bill. And when special needs arose, a war to fund, a disaster to recover from, special taxes could be levied. Temporary, they promised, just until the crisis passed. Sometimes they even kept that promise. The Roman tax code was complex, varied, and inescapable. Wherever money changed hands, Rome wanted a piece. Here's something fascinating about Roman taxation. For much of Rome's history, the government didn't collect its own taxes. It outsourced. The publicani were private tax farming corporations. They would bid for the right to collect taxes in a particular province, pay Rome a fixed sum up front, guaranteed revenue for the treasury. Then go and collect taxes from the population. Whatever they collected above what they'd paid, profit. You can probably see the problem already. The publicani had every incentive to squeeze as much as possible from provincial populations. They'd paid for the right to collect. They intended to get their money's worth. And more. These were the tax collectors mentioned in the Bible, the ones lumped together with sinners as examples of the despised and corrupt. When Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, he was making a statement. These were the most hated people in Jewish society, and they were hated for good reason. The publicani used force, intimidation, and fraud to maximize their take. They charged interest on unpaid taxes. They confiscated property. They had the backing of Roman law and Roman soldiers. Corruption wasn't a bug in this system. It was a feature. Everyone knew the publicani took more than they were owed. Rome didn't care, as long as the treasury received its fixed payment. The suffering of provincial subjects was someone else's problem. The Roman tax system created a stark divide between citizens and subjects. Roman citizens living in Italy, for much of the Republic and early Empire, paid relatively few direct taxes. The tributum on citizens was suspended after Rome's conquests brought in enough revenue from elsewhere. Citizens still paid sales taxes, customs duties, the inheritance tax. But the crushing burden of direct taxation, that fell on the provinces. Conquered peoples paid heavily. Tax rates varied by province, Some paid 10% of their produce, others as much as 30%. Egypt, Rome's breadbasket, was taxed especially heavily. To know who owed what, Rome conducted regular censuses. Every 5 to 14 years, officials would count the population, assess property, catalogue wealth. The census wasn't just curiosity, it was the foundation of the tax system. Local elites were made responsible for their region's taxes. The Romans were clever about this. If you were a wealthy landowner in Gaul or Syria, the Roman governor would assign you a tax quota for your area. Collect it however you wished. Just make sure Rome got its money. If the quota wasn't met, you paid the difference from your own pocket. This created a class of local collaborators, native elites who had every incentive to squeeze their own people on Rome's behalf. The empire didn't need Roman tax collectors in every village. It could turn conquered peoples against each other. Divide and extract. Rome mastered this art. The tax burden was not evenly distributed, not even close. Provincial subjects bore the heaviest weight. They paid the tributum. They paid customs duties on trade. They watched the publicani grow rich from their labor. Roman citizens had privileges, fewer taxes, legal protections, rights that subjects lacked. But even among provincial populations, inequality was stark. The wealthy could evade many taxes through exemptions, connections, and outright bribery. They knew the officials. They had friends in the governor's office. Certain lands were tax-exempt for certain people. The poor had no such options. Rural peasants faced the heaviest burden. They couldn't hide their wealth. It was in the form of land and crops, visible and countable. They couldn't bribe officials. They had nothing to bribe with. They couldn't flee. Where would they go? They paid, year after year, generation after generation. The foundation of an empire built on their bent backs. Every grand building in Rome, every triumphal arch, every day of games at the Colosseum, all of it funded by taxes extracted from people who would never see the city, never benefit from its grandeur, never share in the glory. Where did all that money go? The legions, first and foremost. Rome's military was enormous and professional. Soldiers served for 20 years and expected regular pay, plus a retirement bonus. At its height, the Roman army numbered over 400,000 men. That's 400,000 salaries, plus equipment, plus food, plus transport, plus the pensions of veterans. The military consumed perhaps half of Roman government spending, maybe more during wartime. Then there were the public works, those famous Roman roads connecting every corner of the empire, aqueducts bringing fresh water to cities, public baths, forums, temples, basilicas. Rome built on a scale that wouldn't be matched for 1,000 years after its fall. In Rome itself, the government provided free grain to citizens. The grain dole fed hundreds of thousands of urban poor. Without it, they might starve or riot. Either way, the dole was expensive. And the games, gladiatorial combats, chariot races, wild animal hunts, spectacles that kept the urban masses entertained and distracted, bread and circuses, as the satirist Juvenal noted. Both cost money. Finally, the bureaucracy itself. Tax collectors needed paying. Provincial governors, imperial administrators, clerks and scribes and officials at every level. The empire was a vast machine, and every part needed feeding. Roman taxes built an empire of unprecedented scale, but maintaining that empire required ever more taxes. The system worked beautifully until it didn't. By the 200s CE, cracks were appearing. The empire faced constant warfare. On the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes pressed relentlessly. In the east, the Persian Empire posed an existential threat. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, sometimes several in a single year. War requires money. More war requires more money. Taxes increased, but the economy was struggling. Trade routes were disrupted. Population was declining. There was less wealth to tax, yet the demands grew greater. Rome tried to solve the problem by debasing the currency, adding less silver to each coin, minting more coins from the same amount of metal. This worked briefly, then inflation took hold. When Diocletian became emperor in 284 CE, the silver coinage was nearly worthless. A coin that once bought a loaf of bread now barely bought a crumb. Diocletian reformed everything. He introduced the annona, a tax paid not in worthless coins, but in goods: grain, cloth, labor. If money meant nothing, the government would take things that still had value. People were now taxed in kind. Farmers owed a portion of their harvest. Craftsmen owed products. Some owed their labor directly. It was, in a sense, a return to the beginning, to Mesopotamia and Egypt, where taxes had always been paid in grain. Rome's sophisticated monetary economy had collapsed back into something more primitive. The reforms stabilized the empire for a time, but the trajectory was set. Throughout Roman history, people resisted. The Jewish revolts of 66 to 73 CE and 132-136 CE had many causes, but taxation was among them. The tribute to Rome, the publicani who squeezed Judean peasants, the census of Quirinius, which provoked outrage by counting people like property. Peasant rebellions flared across the empire. The Bagaudai, movements of desperate rural poor in Gaul and Spain, rose repeatedly in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, crushed each time, rising again each time. Tax collectors were assassinated, not often enough to deter others, but often enough to make the job dangerous. Some collectors traveled with armed guards. Some didn't travel at all, demanding that taxpayers come to them. People fled. When the census came, they vanished into forests, into mountains, into the territories of friendly barbarians beyond the frontier. Anywhere to escape the counting that preceded the taxing. Records show desperate measures. Fathers selling children into slavery to pay tax debts, farmers abandoning their land rather than face another assessment. Villages simply emptied, their populations scattered to the winds. The empire's response was to tie people to their land. If you were born a peasant farmer, you died a peasant farmer. Bound to the soil, unable to leave without permission. Freedom sacrificed to maintain the tax base. By the 400s CE, something had broken. The tax burden was crushing, and the services that taxes supposedly paid for, they were failing. The legions couldn't hold the frontiers. The roads fell into disrepair. The aqueducts crumbled. You paid more and received less. Here's a remarkable thing. When barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, established themselves in former Roman territories, some Roman subjects welcomed them. Why? Because the barbarians taxed less. The new Germanic kingdoms didn't have Rome's massive administrative apparatus, didn't have 400,000 soldiers to pay, didn't have a capital city of 1 million people to feed. They took a smaller share and left people alone. Roman aristocrats sometimes complained about life under barbarian rule. But peasants? For them, the fall of Rome meant lighter taxes, less intrusion, more of their own harvest staying in their own granaries. The empire that had been built on taxes was abandoned by people who could no longer bear the burden. When the system that protects you also crushes you, you stop caring whether it survives. Rome's greatest strength, its ability to extract resources from a vast territory, became its fatal weakness. The extraction exceeded what the system could bear. What did Rome leave behind? Proof that taxation could build an empire of unprecedented scale, that organized, systematic collection of revenue could fund armies, roads, cities, and centuries of dominance. But also proof that taxation has limits. Push too hard, take too much, give back too little, and the whole structure collapses. Many modern tax concepts originated in Rome. The census, the word itself, is Latin. The idea that citizenship comes with tax obligations, customs duties on trade, inheritance taxes. The distinction between direct taxes on property and indirect taxes on transactions. The use of local intermediaries to collect on behalf of a central government. The eternal tension between efficiency and corruption. All of it echoes through the centuries, from Roman tax collectors to modern revenue agencies. The names change, the fundamental dynamics remain. Rome fell, but taxes didn't. In fact, medieval Europe was about to get creative. Rome's tax system, for all its flaws, its corruption, its crushing weight, was at least organized, predictable. You knew what you owed and to whom you owed it. When Rome fell, that system collapsed. What replaced it wasn't simpler, it wasn't lighter. It was, in many ways, far worse. Welcome to medieval Europe, where you didn't just owe taxes to one master, you owed obligations to everyone, your lord, your church, your king. Layers upon layers of demands, each one extracting a piece of your labor, your harvest, your very existence. This was feudalism. And for the peasants at the bottom of the pyramid, it was suffocating. After Rome's collapse in the West, centralized government essentially disappeared. No more empire-wide tax collection. No more professional bureaucracies. No more roads maintained and armies paid from a central treasury. What emerged instead was feudalism, a system of mutual obligations binding society together in a rigid hierarchy. At the top, the king, who theoretically owned all the land. Below him, the great nobles, who held land in exchange for military service and loyalty. Below them, lesser nobles and knights, who held smaller parcels on similar terms. And at the bottom, the peasants, who worked the land and owed everything. Technically, what peasants paid weren't taxes. They were feudal dues, obligations, fees, and services owed to their lord in exchange for protection and the right to work his land. The distinction was meaningless to the peasant handing over half his harvest. Call it what you want, it was extraction, and it came from every direction. Let's walk through what a medieval peasant actually owed. The list is exhausting. First, labor. The corvée system required peasants to work their lord's fields a certain number of days each week, typically 2 or 3. During harvest season, more. Your own fields waited while you sweated on his. Second, a share of your harvest. Not a small share. Typically, 30 to 50% of everything you grew went to the lord. After giving your labor and your crops, what remained was yours, barely enough to survive. Third, fees for using the lord's facilities. Want to grind your grain into flour? You must use the lord's mill and pay for the privilege. Want to bake bread? The lord's oven. A fee. Press your grapes? The Lord's wine press, another fee. These were called banalities. Monopoly rights the Lord held over essential services. You couldn't build your own mill. You paid or you didn't eat bread. Fourth, the Heriot. When a peasant died, the Lord claimed his best animal, often the family's only cow or ox. A death tax, extracted at the moment of greatest vulnerability. Fifth, tallage. This was the truly arbitrary one. The Lord could simply demand payment whenever he needed money. No justification required, no limit specified. He asked, you paid. Sixth, merche. Want to marry? Pay a fee. Want your daughter to marry? Another fee. Your personal life belonged to the Lord. Seventh, shevage. Want to leave the manor? Pay for permission, if permission was even granted. Most peasants were bound to the land. They couldn't leave without their lord's consent. Every major life event, every basic necessity, every transaction. The Lord took his share. But wait, the Lord wasn't your only master. There was also the church. The tithe was the foundation of church taxation. 1/10 of everything you produced, grain, vegetables, livestock, everything, went to support the church. This wasn't optional. It wasn't a suggestion. Tithing was mandatory across medieval Europe, enforced by both religious and secular authority. Failure to tithe could result in excommunication, which meant not just spiritual death, but social death. No one would deal with an excommunicated person. The tithe went to maintain the local church, support the priest, and fund the broader church hierarchy. In theory, some came back as charity for the poor. In practice, much flowed upward to bishops, monasteries, and ultimately Rome. But the tithe was just the beginning. Peter's pence, an annual payment to the Pope himself. Every household owed a penny, not much individually, but across all of Christendom, it added up. Fees for sacraments. The church charged for baptisms, marriages, and burials. The ceremonies that marked life's passages came with price tags. Want to be buried in consecrated ground? Pay. Special collections for crusades, for building projects, for papal needs. The church always found reasons to ask for more. And the church was everywhere. In an age when spiritual salvation was the primary concern of most people's lives, you couldn't avoid it. You couldn't opt out. You paid, or you risked your immortal soul. So the peasant, already giving half his harvest to the Lord, gave another 10th to the church. What remained was shrinking fast. And then there was the king. Medieval kings had limited direct power over peasants. That's what lords were for. But kings needed money too. And what kings wanted, kings usually got. Scutage, literally shield money. Knights owed military service to the king. If they preferred not to fight, they could pay instead. This money funded mercenaries. The cost was passed down. Lords squeezed their peasants harder to afford it. Aid, special taxes for specific royal needs. The king ransomed from captivity, everyone paid. The king's eldest son knighted, everyone paid. The king's eldest daughter married, everyone paid. Major royal events meant major extractions. Customs duties, kings taxed trade, collecting fees on goods moving into and out of the realm. Merchants paid directly, but passed costs to consumers. Everyone paid higher prices. Forest laws, vast tracts of land, were designated royal forests. Hunting there was forbidden. Gathering wood was forbidden. Letting your pigs forage for acorns was forbidden. Violators faced heavy fines, or worse. These laws seem absurd today, but they generated revenue. Every poacher caught, every peasant gathering firewood where he shouldn't. Fines payable to the crown. The king's demands filtered down through the pyramid. Lords raised rents, pressed harder on their peasants. The weight at the bottom grew heavier. Town dwellers, merchants, craftsmen, urban workers faced a different tax landscape. They'd often escaped feudal obligations by living in chartered towns. City air makes you free, the medieval saying went. Live in a town for a year and a day, and your lord couldn't reclaim you. But freedom from feudalism didn't mean freedom from taxes. Market fees. To sell goods, you paid for the privilege. To set up a stall, to bring goods through the gates, to weigh your merchandise on official scales, fees at every turn. Guild fees. To practice a trade, you joined a guild. Guilds charged admission, annual dues, and special assessments. They regulated competition but extracted payment for the privilege. Municipal taxes. Towns needed walls, guards, infrastructure. Citizens paid through local levies, property taxes, poll taxes, excise taxes on goods. Tolls. Move goods from one town to another, and you paid at every gate, every bridge, every boundary. Trade was taxed at every step. Still, town life was generally preferable to peasant life. The obligations, while numerous, were more predictable, the opportunities greater, the weight slightly less crushing. Slightly. Let's add it all up. A medieval peasant might give away 30 to 50% of his harvest to the Lord, another 10% to the church. Labor days that meant he couldn't work his own fields, fees for every mill, oven and wine press, death taxes, marriage taxes, arbitrary tallages whenever the Lord needed cash. Conservative estimates suggest peasants surrendered 60 to 70% of everything they produced. What remained barely kept them alive. And here's the cruel part. Obligations were fixed. If the harvest was good, you might survive. If the harvest was bad, you still owed the same amounts. Crop failure didn't reduce your tithe. Famine didn't suspend your labor obligations. Plague that killed half your family didn't cancel your heriot when the survivors died. The demands were constant. The production varied. In bad years, the math simply didn't work. This was one of history's most exploitative systems. Multiple layers of extraction, each one justified by tradition, by religion, by the social order itself. The peasant was told this was how things had always been, how things were supposed to be. To resist was to defy God's ordained hierarchy. But people did resist. Throughout the medieval period, peasants pushed back, sometimes through small acts, hiding grain, underreporting livestock, evading collectors, sometimes through explosion. The Jacquerie erupted in France in 1358. The name came from Jacques Bonhomme, a generic name for French peasants. Like John Doe, the trigger was the aftermath of military disaster. French nobles, defeated and captured at the Battle of Poitiers, demanded ransoms. The peasants were expected to pay. Meanwhile, the same nobles had failed to protect them from English raiders devastating the countryside. The peasants snapped. They attacked manor houses, killed nobles, burned estates. For a few weeks, the social order seemed to collapse. Then came the reprisal. Nobles rallied. The revolt was crushed with spectacular brutality. Thousands of peasants killed. Villages burned. The message, know your place. 23 years later, England had its turn. Wat Tyler's Rebellion of 1381 began when royal tax collectors, pursuing a new poll tax, pushed too hard. The peasants of Kent and Essex rose up. They marched on London. They burned the palace of the hated tax administrator, John of Gaunt. Their rallying cry asked a devastating question. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In the Garden of Eden, there were no lords and peasants, no nobles and serfs. The social hierarchy was a human invention. Why should they obey it? The young King Richard II met the rebels, made promises. The rebels dispersed. Then the promises were broken. The leaders were hunted down and executed. The poll tax was withdrawn, but the system remained. Every major peasant revolt in medieval Europe ended this way. Brief hope, brutal suppression, return to the grinding normal. But the revolts kept coming because the system was unsustainable, and everyone knew it. By the late medieval period, the feudal patchwork was beginning to change. Kings wanted more power, more centralized authority, more control over their realms. This required money, professional armies, standing bureaucracies, infrastructure, things feudal obligations couldn't reliably provide. In England, the struggle over taxation shaped constitutional history itself. The Magna Carta of 1215 established that the king couldn't levy certain taxes without consent of his council. From this seed grew Parliament, initially a body of nobles and churchmen, later expanded to include commoners. By the 14th century, the principle was established. The king needed Parliament's approval for major taxation. No taxation without representation would become famous in a later century, but the idea was already ancient. In France, development went differently. The Estates General, France's equivalent of Parliament, existed but was weaker. French kings gradually established permanent taxes they could collect without consent. The taille became a regular royal tax on peasants. The gabelle taxed salt, a necessity everyone needed. Customs duties on trade flowed to the crown continuously. Both paths led to the same destination, the modern tax state. Centralized collection, professional administrators, permanent revenue streams. The feudal pyramid was being replaced by something more efficient. Not necessarily gentler, but more organized. Nothing drives taxation like war, and medieval Europe's greatest conflict would prove it. The 100 Years' War, actually a series of conflicts stretching from 1337 to 1453, pitted England against France in a ruinously expensive struggle. Wars required soldiers. Soldiers required pay. Pay required taxes. Both kingdoms imposed heavier and heavier burdens. New taxes created. Old taxes increased. Collection became more ruthless, more organized, more inescapable. England's parliament gained power precisely because the king needed it to approve war funding. France's monarchy gained power by establishing permanent taxes that kept flowing regardless of consent. Military defeats were blamed on insufficient revenue. If only we had more taxes, we'd have more soldiers, we'd win the war. The logic was irresistible to kings, and so the machinery of extraction grew more sophisticated. Tax rolls documented every household. Collectors penetrated every village. Evasion became harder. The 100 Years' War ended medieval Europe's fiscal amateurism. Professional taxation was the future, and it was arriving fast. So there's the medieval tax landscape, a suffocating weight of obligations from every direction. The Lord took your labor and your harvest. The church took your tithe and your sacrament fees. The king took whatever he could extract through nobles, through duties, through forest fines. A peasant family might keep barely a third of what they produced, and when that wasn't enough to survive, the obligations continued regardless. People resisted. They hid grain. They revolted. They asked dangerous questions about whether this hierarchy was truly ordained by God. They were suppressed, but they planted seeds that would eventually bloom. As Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, taxation was about to get even more organized. Kings were building permanent bureaucracies, centralizing collection, professionalizing extraction. And where there are organized taxes, there are organized tax collectors, men who made careers and fortunes from squeezing populations. In our next segment, we'll meet the tax farmers, private entrepreneurs who bought the right to collect taxes and kept whatever they could extract beyond the purchase price. A system so corrupt, so brutal, that it helped spark revolutions. That story comes next. The medieval world was messy. Feudal obligations, local lords, scattered authorities, taxes that varied from village to village. A king might claim sovereignty, but actually collecting revenue from distant territories. That required cooperation from dozens of intermediaries, each taking their cut. But something changed in the centuries after 1500. States grew stronger, bureaucracies grew larger, and taxes became systematic. We're entering the era that created the tax systems we still live with today. The 1500s through the 1700s were centuries of almost constant warfare in Europe. Religious wars, dynastic wars, wars of succession, wars of empire. The continent seemed incapable of peace for more than a few years at a stretch, and war, as always, costs money. Enormous amounts of money. The old feudal system couldn't meet the demands. In medieval times, a king called upon his vassals, who called upon their knights, who showed up for a fighting season and then went home. Armies were temporary, obligations were personal, but warfare was changing. Professional armies were replacing feudal levies, soldiers who trained year-round, who needed paying year-round. Gunpowder weapons that cost fortunes to manufacture. Fortifications that took years to build and fortunes to maintain. A king who wanted to wage war, and they all did, needed reliable permanent revenue, not the uncertain trickle of feudal dues, but a steady flow of money into state coffers. Professional taxes for professional armies. This is when the modern tax state was born. Not from philosophy or planning, but from the desperate need to fund the next war. Let's start with Spain, which in the 1500s controlled the greatest windfall in history. The New World, the Americas, gold and silver beyond imagination. Spanish conquistadors conquered the Aztec and Inca empires and discovered mines of staggering richness. The Silver Mountain of Potosi alone would produce billions of dollars worth of metal over the following centuries, and the Spanish crown intended to tax every ounce. The quinto real, the royal fifth. 20% of all precious metals extracted from the New World belonged to the king. 1 coin in every 5, straight to the treasury. This was in addition to the alcabarala, a sales tax that reached as high as 14% on transactions, plus customs duties, plus taxes on indigenous populations, plus the usual European taxes back home. Spain should have been the richest nation on earth. For a time, it was, and yet, Spain went bankrupt multiple times. 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607. Again and again, throughout the 1600s. How do you tax rivers of silver and still go broke? Constant warfare. The Spanish Habsburgs fought everyone: France, England, the Dutch, the Ottomans, Protestant princes in Germany. They fought for religion, for dynasty, for glory. And they spent faster than even New World silver could flow. Turns out you can tax infinite gold and still mismanage finances. The Spanish Empire proved that wealth means nothing without fiscal discipline, a lesson that would be ignored by governments for centuries to come. France took a different approach, a worse approach, if such a thing were possible. Tax farming. The French kings needed money now, not in 6 months when taxes were collected. Now, to pay soldiers, to fund sieges, to maintain the magnificence of Versailles. So they sold the right to collect taxes to private financiers. Here's how it worked. A consortium of wealthy investors, the Ferme Générale, would pay the king a lump sum up front. In exchange, they received the right to collect certain taxes for a set period. Whatever they collected above what they'd paid, profit. Sound familiar? It's the Roman publicani system reborn, and just as corrupt. The tax farmers became fantastically wealthy. They built mansions. They married into nobility. They lived like princes while squeezing peasants for every sou. The more they extracted, the more they kept. There was no incentive for mercy, no reason for restraint. The French people hated them with a burning passion, not just disliked, hated. The tax farmers became symbols of everything wrong with the Ancien Regime, parasites who grew fat on the misery of honest people, collaborators with a system designed to bleed the poor for the benefit of the rich. This hatred would be remembered. When the French Revolution came in 1789, tax farmers were among the first targets. Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, was also a tax farmer. He was guillotined for it. His scientific genius didn't save him. Nothing could save a tax farmer once the people had their chance for revenge. The system that enriched a few had created enemies of millions. England developed differently, not necessarily better, but differently. The English had a saying, rooted deep in their political tradition: the king could not tax without the consent of Parliament. This wasn't just philosophy, it was practical power. English monarchs needed money. Parliament controlled the purse strings. Every tax required parliamentary approval. This created constant tension. Monarchs wanted revenue. Parliament wanted concessions. Each tax bill became a negotiation, a trade of money for rights. When Charles V tried to raise money without Parliament in the 1630s, through ship money and other creative measures, the conflict eventually erupted into civil war. The English Civil War of the 1640s had many causes: religion, politics, personality. But money was woven through all of it. Who had the right to tax? Who controlled the revenue of the state? The king lost. Charles V lost his head on the executioner's block in 1649, and when the monarchy was eventually restored, it came with limits. Parliament controlled taxation. That was settled. No taxation without representation would become a slogan associated with America. But the idea was thoroughly English. It meant that those who paid taxes had a right to voice in how they were levied. A revolutionary concept, and one that would travel across the Atlantic to cause considerable trouble for the British Empire. Governments needed money. Direct taxes were politically difficult, so they turned increasingly to excise taxes, levies on specific goods. Salt was taxed almost everywhere, essential for preserving food, impossible to do without, easy to control at points of production and sale. The gabelle in France was so hated that armed salt smugglers operated throughout the countryside. Tobacco was taxed, alcohol was taxed heavily, and remains so today. Soap was taxed in England, making cleanliness literally costly. Paper was taxed, playing cards were taxed, newspapers were taxed, and windows, yes, windows. In 1696, England introduced the window tax. Houses were taxed based on the number of windows they had. More windows meant more wealth, the logic went. More wealth meant more tax. The unintended consequence? People bricked up their windows. Walk through old British cities today and you'll still see it. Buildings with windows that are clearly sealed with brick. Not for privacy or insulation, to avoid tax. Entire generations lived in darker, less ventilated homes because of a tax designed to be impossible to evade. The window tax lasted until 1851. Over 150 years of people choosing darkness over payment. Governments learned that taxing visible things invited creative avoidance, but they kept trying anyway. European empires spread across the globe, and wherever they went, taxes followed. Colonies existed in the imperial view to benefit the mother country. They provided raw materials, captive markets, and most importantly, revenue. The British taxed their American colonies through various measures. The Sugar Act of 1764 taxed molasses and sugar imported from non-British sources. The Stamp Act of 1765 required tax stamps on legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, even playing cards. The colonists were not pleased. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. They were being taxed by a parliament in which they had no voice, no representatives, no vote. The Stamp Act was repealed, but Parliament insisted on its right to tax the colonies. The Townshend Acts followed. Taxes on glass, lead, paints, paper, tea. Then the Tea Act, which led to the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And then revolution. The American Revolution began, fundamentally, as a tax revolt. The specific grievances were about representation and rights, but the trigger was taxation. The unwillingness of colonists to pay levies they hadn't approved, and they won. This was new. Tax revolts had happened before. We've discussed several, but they usually failed. The state had soldiers, the rebels had pitchforks. America proved that sometimes the rebels could win, that an empire could be successfully defied, that taxes pushed too far on people who felt they had no voice could bring down the entire system. A lesson the British learned too late. A lesson other empires would also learn too late. For most of history, governments tax things. Land, goods, transactions, windows, taxing income, the money you actually earned, was considered impractical and intrusive. How would you even know what someone earned? People didn't have pay stubs. They didn't file annual reports. Their financial lives were private, and they intended to keep them that way. But war, as always, demanded innovation. In 1799, Britain was fighting Napoleon. The wars had dragged on for years, with no end in sight. Traditional taxes weren't enough. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger needed a new source of revenue. He introduced an income tax. People earning above a certain threshold would pay a percentage of their income to the government. 2 shillings per pound for the highest earners, a rate of 10%. It was supposed to be temporary, just until the war ended. The war ended in 1815. The income tax was repealed. Everyone celebrated. Then it came back. In 1842, Robert Peel reintroduced it. Temporary again, of course, just for a few years, just until the budget was balanced. It never left. The income tax proved too useful, too efficient, too capable of raising the revenue that modern states required. Once governments discovered they could tax income directly, they never gave up the power. Everyone hated it immediately. They still do. But they pay it anyway. Something else was changing in this era. The people who collected taxes. Tax farming was gradually abandoned. It was too corrupt, too hated, too prone to abuse. The French Revolution had demonstrated what happened when tax farmers faced public judgment. In its place came professional bureaucracies, permanent government employees whose job was to assess and collect taxes. Not entrepreneurs seeking profit, but civil servants following rules. This might sound like a minor change. It wasn't. Professional tax collectors were still unpopular. No one likes the person who takes your money. But they were predictable. They followed laws. They could be held accountable, at least in theory. Better record-keeping emerged. Standardized forms, systematic assessment. The chaotic medieval patchwork of local arrangements gave way to unified national systems. Tax collection became more efficient, more thorough, harder to evade. This was, depending on your perspective, either progress toward fairness or progress toward inescapability. Probably both. The modern tax bureaucracy was taking shape. The ancestors of today's revenue agencies, with their forms and audits and relentless attention to detail. The 1700s were the age of enlightenment. Reason applied to everything, including taxes. In 1776, the same year as American independence, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. Among its many insights were 4 principles of taxation that still echo today. First, equality. Taxes should be proportional to ability to pay. The wealthy should pay more than the poor. Second, certainty. Taxpayers should know what they owe, when it's due, how it's calculated. No arbitrary demands, no surprises. Third, convenience. Taxes should be collected at the time and manner most convenient for the payer. Don't demand payment when people have no money. Fourth, efficiency. The cost of collecting taxes should be minimal compared to the revenue raised. Don't spend £1 to collect a shilling. These principles seem obvious now. They were revolutionary then. For most of history, taxes had been arbitrary, imposed by the powerful on the powerless, collected whenever and however the collector wished, riddled with exemptions for the connected and demands on the defenseless. Smith proposed something radical. Taxes could be fair. Taxes could be rational. Taxes could be designed according to principles rather than just power. In practice, of course, taxes remained neither fair nor rational. But the ideas were planted. The aspiration existed. Future reformers would invoke Smith's principles when arguing for change. By the end of the 1700s, something new had emerged. The tax state, a government defined by its ability to systematically extract revenue from its population. Professional bureaucracies, permanent structures, income taxes joining the ancient levies on land and goods. Warfare had driven this evolution. The need to fund armies that never disbanded, navies that patrolled the seas year-round, administrations that managed global empires. But the infrastructure created for war would be used for other purposes too. Education, infrastructure, social programs. The administrative capacity to tax was also the capacity to spend on public goods. The relationship between citizen and state was transformed, no longer mediated through lords and vassals, local customs and personal obligations. Now direct. now documented, now unavoidable. You were counted, you were assessed, you paid. By the 1800s, the modern tax state was locked in, but the 20th century was about to take taxation to levels no one had imagined. We've traveled from Sumerian temples counting grain, to tax farmers squeezing peasants, to revolutionary movements demanding fairness. But everything we've described, all of it, pales in comparison to what happened in the 20th century. In just 100 years, taxation transformed more radically than it had in the previous 5,000. Governments that once taxed a tiny fraction of their populations began taxing everyone. Rates that would have triggered revolution in any earlier era became normal. And the tax state, that apparatus of collection, enforcement, and redistribution, became so embedded in daily life that most people stopped noticing it. This is the story of how we got here, of wars that demanded impossible sums, of governments that discovered just how much they could take, and of a world that learned to live with levels of taxation our ancestors couldn't have imagined. August 1914. The Great War begins. No one expected what came next. Not the years of trench warfare, not the millions of deaths, and certainly not the price tag. World War I was the most expensive event in human history to that point. The combatant nations spent more money in 4 years than they had in the previous century combined. Armies of millions needed feeding, arming, transporting. Industrial warfare devoured resources at unimaginable rates. Where would the money come from? The answer? Everywhere, from everyone. In the United States, the income tax had only existed since 1913, with a top rate of 7% on incomes over $500,000. By 1918, that top rate was 77%. Read that again. From 7% to 77% in 5 years. And it wasn't just the rich. The tax base expanded dramatically downward. Middle-class Americans who had never paid income tax suddenly did. The tax that had been sold as affecting only the wealthy was reaching into ordinary households. Britain saw similar expansion. France, Germany, every belligerent nation discovered the same truth. Modern war required modern taxation. Mass armies required mass extraction. The most revolutionary innovation was withholding. Previously, taxpayers received their income, then paid taxes later. Now, taxes were taken before you ever saw the money. Your employer sent it directly to the government. You never held it in your hands. This was psychologically brilliant. Money you never see doesn't feel like money you've lost. Withholding made taxation invisible, painless, automatic. The war ended. The rates came down somewhat, but the machinery remained. The precedent was set. When the next crisis came, governments knew exactly how far they could push. The 1920s brought relief. Top tax rates dropped. Prosperity returned, at least for some. The war's emergency measures seemed like a temporary aberration. Then 1929. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. The Great Depression gripped the world. Governments faced a terrible choice. Revenues collapsed as economic activity cratered, but demands increased. Unemployed workers needed relief. Failing industries needed rescue. Social order needed maintaining. The response varied by country. In the United States, Herbert Hoover actually raised taxes in 1932, trying to balance the budget in the midst of depression. Most economists now consider this catastrophically wrong. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal brought a different approach: massive government spending on relief, recovery, and reform. This required revenue. Tax rates climbed again. The top marginal rate, which had dropped to 25% in 1925, rose to 63% by 1932 and kept climbing. New taxes appeared. Social Security, created in 1935, brought payroll taxes, a percentage taken from every worker's wages, with a matching contribution from employers. The interwar period taught governments that taxation wasn't just for emergencies, it was for ongoing governance, for social programs, for economic management. The temporary had become permanent. December 1941. America enters the Second World War. If WWE had been expensive, World War II was ruinous. The United States alone would spend over $300 billion, roughly $5 trillion in today's money, more than any nation had ever spent on anything. Taxation responded accordingly. The top marginal rate in the United States reached 94%. Not a typo. 94% on income over $200,000. Britain's top rate hit 99.25%, and there was a brief period when the British government took essentially everything above a certain threshold. But the truly revolutionary change wasn't the rates on the wealthy, it was the expansion of who paid. Before World War II, most Americans didn't pay federal income tax. The exemptions were high enough that ordinary workers were excluded. That changed completely. By 1945, the number of Americans paying income tax had increased tenfold. The factory worker, the office clerk, the small shopkeeper, everyone now filed tax returns. Everyone now saw withholding on their paychecks. The government mounted propaganda campaigns. "Your tax dollars at work" became a patriotic slogan. Taxes weren't just obligations, they were contributions to the war effort. Disney made cartoons encouraging tax compliance. Donald Duck told Americans to pay their taxes, and enforcement became serious. Tax evasion, previously a somewhat casual offense, was now aggressively criminalized. The famous mobster Al Capone hadn't been jailed for murder. He'd been jailed for tax evasion. The message was clear. When the war ended, the emergency didn't fully disappear. Rates came down, but not to pre-war levels. The mass income tax remained. Withholding remained. The tax state had arrived, and it wasn't leaving. The 3 decades following World War II, roughly 1945 to 1975, saw the full flowering of the modern tax state. Tax rates remained remarkably high by historical standards. In the United States, the top marginal rate stayed above 90% through the 1950s, dropping to 70% in the 1960s. Similar patterns held across Western Europe. This revenue funded an unprecedented expansion of government. Social Security benefits grew. Medicare was created in 1965, providing health insurance for the elderly. Public education expanded massively. The GI Bill sent millions to college. Highway systems were built. Research and development flourished with government funding. The welfare state, that complex of social programs providing security from cradle to grave, was built on tax revenue. And remarkably, people largely accepted it. The post-war generation had lived through depression and war. They understood that collective action required collective resources. High taxes were the price of civilization. The social contract seemed fair. You paid heavily, but you received genuine benefits. This was the high water mark of progressive taxation. The rich paid proportionally more. The system redistributed downward. Inequality actually decreased for the only extended period in American history. It wouldn't last. While income taxes dominated in the United States, Europe was pioneering something different: the value-added tax. The VAT is essentially a consumption tax, but collected at every stage of production rather than just the final sale. Here's how it works. A logger sells wood to a furniture maker. VAT is charged. The furniture maker sells a table to a retailer. VAT is charged on the value added. The retailer sells to a consumer. VAT is charged again. At each stage, businesses can deduct the VAT they've already paid, so only the added value is actually taxed. It's complicated, but it's also remarkably efficient at generating revenue. France pioneered the VAT in 1954. By the 1970s, it had spread across Europe. Today, over 160 countries use some form of VAT. It's essentially the global standard. The United States never adopted it. American states use sales taxes. Similar concept, but collected only at the final point of sale, and rates are much lower. Why did the US resist? Partly politics. A VAT is somewhat hidden. Consumers don't always realize how much they're paying. Critics saw this as dangerously easy to raise. Partly federalism, sales taxes belong to the states, and they didn't want competition. The result? America relies more heavily on income taxes than most developed nations, while Europe relies more on consumption taxes. Different paths to the same destination, extracting enough revenue to fund the modern state. As taxes rose, so did the incentive to avoid them. Switzerland had offered banking secrecy since the 1930s. After WIP2, it became a magnet for wealth seeking to escape taxation elsewhere. Numbered accounts. Client confidentiality protected by law. The Swiss bank became synonymous with hidden money. Other jurisdictions followed. The Cayman Islands, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, the Channel Islands. Each offered some combination of low taxes, banking secrecy, and legal structures that obscured ownership. By the late 20th century, tax avoidance had become an industry. Multinational corporations became masters of the game. Profits earned in one country could be shifted through licensing agreements, intercompany loans, transfer pricing to low-tax jurisdictions. On paper, the valuable intellectual property belonged to a subsidiary in Ireland or Bermuda. The profits flowed there. The taxes stayed minimal. Wealthy individuals weren't far behind. Offshore trusts, shell companies, complex structures designed by armies of lawyers and accountants, all perfectly legal, all designed to minimize tax obligations. How much money hides offshore? Estimates vary wildly. The Panama Papers leak in 2016 revealed 11.5 million documents from a single law firm, exposing the hidden wealth of politicians, celebrities, and business leaders worldwide. The Paradise Papers followed a year later with even more revelations. The scale is staggering. Trillions of dollars, enough to transform public budgets worldwide. Governments have pushed back with information sharing agreements, transparency requirements, and enforcement actions. The progress is real, but slow. The cat-and-mouse game continues. It always has. By the late 1970s, a backlash was building. Inflation was eroding purchasing power. Economic growth had stagnated. The post-war consensus, high taxes, strong unions, active government, seemed to be failing. Enter Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher. The argument was simple. Taxes were too high. They discouraged work, investment, and risk-taking. Cut taxes, especially on the wealthy and on businesses, and the economy would boom. Growth would follow. Perhaps, some argued, tax revenue would actually increase because the economy would expand so much. Reagan's Tax Reform Act of 1986 slashed the top marginal rate from 50% to 28%. It was the most dramatic cut since the 1920s. Thatcher cut Britain's top rate from 83% to 40%. Corporate taxes fell across the developed world. Capital gains, profits from selling investments, became taxed at lower rates than wages. The logic: encourage investment. The results are still debated fiercely. Supporters point to the economic growth of the 1980s and 1990s. Critics point to soaring inequality, stagnant wages for workers, and growing government deficits. What's undeniable? The tax structure changed fundamentally. The post-war era of aggressively progressive taxation ended. A new orthodoxy, lower rates, especially at the top, became dominant. Top rates have fluctuated since, but never returned to post-war levels. Traditional taxation rested on physical realities. Factories existed in specific places. Workers crossed specific borders. Goods moved through specific ports. The digital economy shattered these assumptions. Where is Amazon located? Legally in Seattle, but its servers are everywhere. Its sales cross every border. Its Luxembourg subsidiary somehow generates most of the profit. Where is Google's value created? By engineers in California, by users uploading data worldwide, by advertisers in every country. How do you tax a company that exists everywhere and nowhere? Governments are still figuring this out. The European Union has pushed for digital services taxes, levies on tech giants based on where their users are, not where they're headquartered. The United States, home to most of these giants, has resisted. International negotiations grind forward. A 2021 agreement established a global minimum corporate tax of 15%, an attempt to prevent the race to the bottom. Implementation remains complex. And then there's cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and thousands of other digital currencies exist outside traditional financial systems. Transactions are pseudonymous. Wealth can move invisibly across borders. Tax authorities struggle to track what they cannot see. Some cryptocurrency holders pay their taxes honestly. Others clearly do not. The technology moves faster than the tax code. It always has. The United States Federal Tax Code runs over 6,000 pages. With associated regulations and guidance, it exceeds 70,000 pages. No one, literally no one, understands all of it. Every exemption, deduction, and credit exists for a reason. Someone lobbied for it. Some policy goal justified it. But the cumulative effect is a maze that benefits those who can afford guides. Wealthy individuals and corporations employ armies of tax professionals. The best minds in law and accounting dedicate careers to minimizing clients' tax burdens. This is all legal. It's also enormously expensive, affordable only to those who already have resources. For ordinary people, the system is bewildering. Should you itemize deductions or take the standard deduction? What counts as a business expense? How do you report that side income? The questions pile up. A massive industry exists to help: H&R Block, TurboTax, countless CPAs, and tax preparers. Americans spend billions of dollars annually just figuring out what they owe. Many countries make it simpler. In some European nations, the government calculates your taxes for you. You receive a statement. You confirm or dispute it. Done. Why doesn't America do this? Partly, the tax preparation industry lobbies against simplification. Complexity is their business model. Partly American individualism. People want control over their own calculations. The result? A system that punishes the unsophisticated and rewards those who can afford sophistication. Step back and marvel at the scope. We tax income, federal, state, and sometimes local. We tax payroll, Social Security and Medicare extracted from every paycheck. We tax consumption, sales taxes, excise taxes, VAT. We tax property, your home, your car, your assets. We tax capital gains when you sell investments. We tax estates when you die. We tax corporations on their profits. We tax specific goods, alcohol, tobacco, gasoline, sometimes to discourage use, sometimes just because we can. There is almost nothing that goes untaxed. Every transaction, every earning, every transfer of wealth, somewhere a tax authority is interested. This is the modern tax state, omnipresent, complex, inescapable, funding everything from missiles to Medicare, from highways to housing subsidies, and yet the fundamental questions remain unanswered. How much taxation is enough? Conservatives say less, progressives say more. Economists offer models, but models aren't consensus. Who should pay? Should the burden fall primarily on income, consumption, wealth? Each choice has consequences. Each reflects values. What should taxes fund? Military or medicine? Infrastructure or innovation? The debates rage endlessly. These questions are as old as civilization. The Sumerians argued about grain assessments. The Romans debated tribute levels. Medieval peasants asked why they owed so much to lords who did so little. We're still arguing. We always will be. Taxation is ultimately a collective decision about what kind of society we want to be. The numbers on your tax return reflect centuries of history, decades of politics, and fundamental disagreements about justice, efficiency, and the proper role of government. There are no final answers, only ongoing negotiation. Taxation has come a long way from Sumerian grain taxes, from Egyptian corvées to Roman tribute to feudal dues to revolutionary tax reform to the mass taxation of the 20th century. But around the world, the story varies wildly. Some nations tax heavily and provide generously. Others barely tax at all, with consequences both good and ill. In our next segment, we'll explore how different countries approach taxation today and what their choices reveal about their societies. We've traveled through time. Now, let's travel through space. Tax systems vary enormously across the globe. What seems normal in one country would spark revolution in another. What citizens accept without complaint in one culture provokes fierce resistance elsewhere. Let's circle the world and see how different societies have answered the eternal question: how much should people pay and what should they receive in return? We begin in the north. Denmark, Sweden, Norway. The Scandinavian countries that consistently rank among the happiest, healthiest, and most prosperous on earth. They also have some of the highest taxes. Top marginal income tax rates reach 50 to 60%. When you add in other levies, payroll taxes, consumption taxes, local taxes, the total tax burden can approach 45 to 50% of the entire economy. Half of everything produced goes to the government. In most places, such rates would provoke outrage, tax revolts, political upheaval. In Scandinavia, general acceptance, even support. Why? Because the taxes come with something in return. Universal healthcare. Not just available, but high quality. You don't choose between paying rent and seeing a doctor. Free education, not just primary school, but university. Students graduate without crushing debt. Generous pensions. Parental leave measured in months, not weeks. Unemployment benefits that allow dignity while seeking work. Childcare that doesn't consume half a family's income. The social democratic model. High taxes, high services. A collective agreement that everyone contributes and everyone benefits. It's not without critics. Some argue it stifles entrepreneurship. Others find the tax burden oppressive despite the benefits. Brain drain to lower tax countries is a concern. But the system works for Scandinavia. Whether it could work elsewhere, with different histories and cultures, remains debated. The Scandinavian model proves that high taxes can coexist with prosperity and happiness. It doesn't prove that high taxes cause those things. Correlation is not causation, but it's evidence worth considering. Cross the Atlantic to America, and you find a different philosophy entirely. American taxes are lower than most developed nations. The top federal income tax rate hovers around 37%. Combined with state and local taxes, the total burden varies wildly. Living in Texas is different from living in California, which is different from living in New York City. The system is complex, famously, bewilderingly complex. Thousands of pages of tax code, loopholes and deductions and credits that require professional help to navigate. An entire industry exists just to help Americans file their taxes. Lower taxes mean lower public services. Americans pay less to the government, but pay more directly for things that Scandinavians receive free. Healthcare comes through employers or private purchase, or doesn't come at all. University means student loans that can take decades to repay. Childcare, elder care, housing, market rates, personal responsibility. The trade-off is explicit, if not always acknowledged. You keep more of your money. You're responsible for more of your needs. Political debate over taxation is fierce and never-ending. Every election features arguments about who pays too much, who pays too little, what government should provide, what individuals should handle themselves. The Boston Tea Party happened here. The spirit of tax resistance runs deep. Americans, more than most peoples, see taxation as something to be minimized rather than accepted. Whether this produces better outcomes is contested. Americans work more hours, retire later, and experience more financial stress than Scandinavians. They also enjoy more economic dynamism, more geographic mobility, more billionaires, different values, different systems, different lives. Britain stands between the extremes. Top income tax rates around 45%. Higher than America, lower than Sweden. A middle path that tries to balance private enterprise with public provision. The crown jewel is the National Health Service, the NHS. Founded in 1948, it provides healthcare to everyone, funded by taxes. No bills at the point of service, no choosing between treatment and bankruptcy. British people are fiercely protective of the NHS. Political parties compete to claim they'll protect it best. Promising to cut it is electoral suicide. Yet the system strains. Waiting times grow. Staff shortages persist. Funding never seems adequate. The eternal question: are we taxing enough to fund what we've promised? Britain also pioneered the value-added tax, the VAT, now used throughout Europe and much of the world. A consumption tax embedded in every transaction, nearly invisible to consumers who pay it with every purchase. Brexit raised new tax questions. What tariffs on trade? What rules for corporations? Britain is still working out its relationship with its neighbours and its own fiscal identity. The British system reflects British character, pragmatic, evolutionary, skeptical of ideology. Not the lowest taxes, not the highest, muddling through, as they like to say. France matches Scandinavian tax rates, but not Scandinavian acceptance. Top marginal rates around 45%, plus wealth taxes, plus social charges that push the total burden very high. Comprehensive benefits, healthcare, pensions, unemployment support, similar to northern neighbours. But the French have a different relationship with taxation. They resist. The Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, erupted in 2018, originally over fuel tax increases. Working people who felt squeezed by costs of living while the wealthy escaped. Riots in Paris, cars burning, a government forced to retreat. This wasn't new. France has a long tradition of taking to the streets when taxes feel unjust. The revolution began partly over taxation, remember? That spirit persists. The French want high-quality public services. They also want someone else to pay for them. The wealthy, preferably. Corporations, foreigners, anyone but ordinary workers who already feel stretched thin. President Hollande proposed a 75% top tax rate in 2012. Some wealthy French fled to Belgium, to Switzerland, to London. The tax was eventually abandoned. The tension persists. High expectations, limited willingness to pay, periodic explosions of frustration. France proves that high taxes don't guarantee social peace. The perception of fairness matters as much as the rates themselves. Cross to the Pacific, and the diversity multiplies. Japan has moderate taxes by developed nation standards, but it faces a unique challenge: the oldest population on Earth. More retirees drawing pensions, fewer workers paying in. The math grows more difficult each year. South Korea built a modern tax system in a single generation, transforming from war-torn poverty to high-tech prosperity. Taxes fund a growing welfare state, though less generous than European models. China presents complexities. The official tax system is sophisticated on paper. In practice, compliance varies enormously. Local governments rely heavily on land sales rather than traditional taxation. The informal economy remains vast. Singapore chose a different path entirely. Low income taxes, no capital gains tax. A business-friendly environment that attracted global corporations and wealthy individuals. But Singaporeans pay in other ways. High costs for cars, for housing. The government controls much of the economy directly rather than taxing and spending. Hong Kong, before recent changes, was even more minimal. A simple, low-tax system that made it a global financial center. Each Asian economy made different choices, different paths to prosperity. No single Asian model, just varied experiments in how to fund modern societies. The diversity suggests there's no one right answer. Context matters. History matters. Culture matters. For wealthy nations, the debate is about how much to tax and what to fund. For much of the world, the challenge is more basic. How do you collect taxes at all? Many developing countries struggle with tax capacity. The government knows it should collect revenue, but actually doing so proves enormously difficult. Informal economies evade taxation. Street vendors, small farmers, day laborers, they exist outside the formal system. No pay stubs, no registered businesses, no way to track income. Corruption siphons what revenue does exist. Tax collectors bribed to look away, officials diverting funds to personal accounts, systems where paying taxes feels like funding theft rather than public goods. Without tax revenue, governments can't provide services. Without services, citizens see no reason to pay taxes. A vicious cycle that's hard to break. Foreign aid sometimes fills the gap, but this creates its own problems. If the government's budget comes from foreign donors rather than domestic taxpayers, who does the government answer to? Not its own citizens. Building a functioning tax state took wealthy countries centuries. Developing nations are trying to compress that process into decades. Some are succeeding. Rwanda has dramatically improved tax collection. Kenya's digital payment systems are bringing the informal economy into view. Progress is possible, but it's slow, and the path is anything but clear. Some countries don't need taxes at all, or so it seems. The Gulf states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, sit atop vast oil reserves. The revenue from selling petroleum dwarfs what taxation could provide. No income tax, often no property tax. Generous subsidies on fuel and electricity and food. Citizens receive benefits without paying in the traditional sense. The ruling families make a different bargain with their people. We'll fund your comfort. You'll accept our authority. Representation unnecessary when revenue doesn't come from the taxed. But what happens when the oil runs out? Or when the world stops buying it? These countries are trying to diversify. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, Dubai's transformation into a tourist and financial hub. But they remain profoundly dependent on hydrocarbons. The day will come, whether in decades or generations, when oil is no longer the foundation. Then the Gulf states will face what every other nation faces: the need to tax their own citizens. That transition could be smooth, or it could be turbulent. Building tax infrastructure and tax acceptance takes time, and time may be shorter than anyone expects. At the other extreme, some places compete by offering almost nothing. The Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Monaco, Jersey, the Isle of Man. Tiny territories that attract global wealth by charging minimal taxes. Want to shelter your fortune? Park it in a jurisdiction with no income tax, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax. Legal in most cases. Ethical? That's debated. Multinational corporations route profits through these havens, legally reducing what they owe to countries where they actually operate. Wealthy individuals establish residency, escaping the tax obligations of their home nations. Other countries resent this. Revenue that should fund their schools and hospitals flows instead to tropical islands with more shell companies than people. International pressure builds. Transparency requirements increase. The OECD coordinates efforts to crack down on the most aggressive schemes. But tax havens adapt. New structures replace old ones. The wealthy can afford lawyers who stay ahead of regulators. As long as tax rates differ between jurisdictions, people and money will flow toward the lowest. Geography becomes strategy. Residency becomes a financial decision. This creates a dilemma for every nation. If you raise taxes, businesses and wealthy individuals might leave, move to Ireland, with its 12.5% corporate rate. Move to Portugal, offering special deals to retirees. Move anywhere that charges less. So countries compete, lowering rates to attract investment, offering special deals to lure corporations. A race to the bottom, critics call it. But there's pushback. In 2021, over 130 countries agreed to a global minimum corporate tax of 15%, an attempt to put a floor under the competition. Will it work? Implementation is complex. Enforcement is uncertain. Countries that benefit from low taxes have little incentive to cooperate fully. The fundamental tension remains. In a world of mobile capital, how do you tax wealth that can move at the speed of a wire transfer? Cryptocurrency adds new wrinkles. Bitcoin and its successors cross borders instantly, pseudonymously. How do you tax decentralized digital assets that exist everywhere and nowhere? Some countries embrace crypto, others bash it. Most are still figuring out how to even track it. The tax systems built for factories and paychecks struggle to comprehend digital wealth. One more development deserves attention. The newest chapter in tax history. Carbon taxes. Charges on emissions of greenhouse gases, making pollution expensive to discourage it. The idea is elegant. If carbon emissions cause climate damage, make people pay for that damage. The price changes behavior, less driving, more efficiency, cleaner energy. Sweden introduced a carbon tax in 1991 and has reduced emissions while growing its economy. British Columbia's carbon tax is often cited as successful, but political resistance is fierce. The French Gilets jaunes erupted over fuel taxes. Australian governments have risen and fallen over carbon pricing. American attempts have repeatedly failed. People support action on climate change in the abstract. They resist paying more for gasoline in the concrete. Carbon taxes raise profound questions. Who bears the burden? Rural drivers or urban elites? What happens to energy-dependent industries? How do you prevent countries with carbon taxes from losing business to countries without them? The debate is just beginning. Climate change demands response. Taxation is one tool. Whether societies will accept it remains uncertain. We've circled the globe, Scandinavia to Singapore, Texas to the Caymans, developed economies and developing ones, oil states and tax havens. What have we learned? Every country taxes differently. There is no single right answer, no perfect system that maximizes revenue while minimizing pain, while achieving fairness, while promoting growth. Trade-offs are inescapable. Higher taxes fund more services, but may discourage work and investment. Lower taxes leave more in private hands, but provide less collective support. Cultural values shape tax systems as much as economic logic. Scandinavians accept what Americans reject. The French demand what Singaporeans forego. History echoes through present debates. Countries that built strong tax states early have different options than those still struggling to collect. Colonial legacies, resource endowments, political structures all shape what's possible. And the debate never ends. Every generation revisits the questions. Every crisis shifts the balance. Every election offers competing visions. There are no final answers, only ongoing negotiations between the individual and the collective, between what we owe and what we're owed, between the government that demands and the citizens who provide. With all these different approaches, one question remains: what are taxes actually for? We've traveled through 5,000 years of taxation, from Sumerian grain counts to Egyptian corvées, from Roman tribute to medieval tithes, from revolutionary tax reform to the mass taxation of the modern state. But we've mostly talked about how taxes worked. The mechanisms, the rates, the collectors, and the collected. Now let's ask a harder question. Why? Why should anyone have to give up a portion of what they earn? What justifies this arrangement? Is taxation fair, necessary, theft, justice? These questions have occupied philosophers for centuries. They occupy angry citizens every April. They have no final answers, but thinking through them carefully might help us understand something fundamental about government, about society, about ourselves. The most influential justification for taxation comes from Enlightenment philosophy, the social contract. The idea, in its simplest form, we agree to be governed. We give up some freedoms, the freedom to take whatever we want, to resolve disputes with violence, to ignore our neighbor's needs. In exchange, we receive security, order, the benefits of collective action. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, imagined life without government as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. We submit to authority because the alternative is chaos. John Locke added nuance. Government exists to protect natural rights, life, liberty, property. We consent because government serves us, not the other way around. When it stops serving, consent can be withdrawn. Jean-Jacques Rousseau pushed further. The social contract should create not just order, but legitimate community. We obey laws we give ourselves. In all these visions, taxation is the price of membership. You benefit from roads, courts, defense, public order. You contribute to their maintenance. The arrangement is, ideally, mutually beneficial. In theory, anyway. The social contract is an elegant idea. It's also an abstraction. You never actually signed anything. You were born into a society with taxes already in place. Your consent is largely assumed. But the logic persists. If you want the benefits of organized society, you pay for them. Within the broad framework of social contract, different principles compete for how taxes should actually work. The benefit principle says you should pay for what you use. Drive on roads, pay road taxes. Use courts, pay court fees. This seems fair. Why should someone subsidize services they don't use? But the benefit principle struggles with public goods. How do you measure how much you benefit from national defense? From public health measures that prevent epidemics? From the educated workforce that makes the economy function? The ability to pay principle argues that those with more resources should contribute more. A dollar means less to a millionaire than to a minimum wage worker. Equal sacrifice means unequal amounts. This justifies progressive taxation, higher rates on higher incomes. But where should the rates stop? Is there a point where taxation becomes confiscatory, where you're essentially punishing success? The redistribution principle goes further. Taxes should actively reduce inequality. Concentrated wealth is bad for society. It distorts politics, limits opportunity, creates instability. Taxation is a tool for creating a more equal world. Critics respond, why should government decide how to redistribute? Who determines what's fair? And doesn't redistribution discourage the productivity that creates wealth in the first place? None of these principles is perfectly implemented anywhere. Real tax systems are compromises, layered with historical accidents, political bargains, and outright contradictions. But the principles matter. They shape the debates. They reveal what we actually value. Set aside philosophy for a moment. What do taxes actually accomplish? They fund public goods, defense, roads, courts, police, fire protection, things that benefit everyone and that markets struggle to provide efficiently. If defense were voluntary, everyone would want protection, but no one would want to pay. The military would be underfunded or non-existent. They provide social insurance, healthcare, pensions, unemployment benefits, protection against risks that individuals can't manage alone. You pay when you're healthy and working. You receive when you're sick or old or jobless. The collective pools risk. They redistribute wealth. Progressive income taxes, estate taxes, means-tested benefits. These shift resources from those with more to those with less. Whether this is justice or theft depends on your perspective. They modify behavior. Sin taxes make cigarettes and alcohol more expensive, discouraging consumption. Carbon taxes make pollution costly, encouraging cleaner alternatives. The tax system becomes a tool for shaping choices. They stabilize the economy. Keynesian theory says governments should spend more during recessions, less during booms. Taxes are the funding mechanism, and sometimes the instrument of adjustment itself. All of this requires revenue. The question isn't whether governments need money. They do. The question is how much, from whom, and for what purposes. Here's a puzzle at the heart of taxation. Everyone benefits from public goods: clean air, national defense, disease control, the rule of law. These goods exist whether or not any individual pays for them. So individuals have an incentive not to pay. Let everyone else fund the military. I'll enjoy the protection anyway. Let everyone else pay for clean water infrastructure. I'll drink the same water. If everyone reasons this way, nothing gets funded. The public goods disappear. Everyone suffers. This is the free rider problem. And it's why taxation is mandatory rather than voluntary. Compulsion solves the problem. Everyone pays, so everyone benefits. No one can opt out. The collective good is maintained. The logic is sound. Accepting it emotionally is harder, because the compulsion is real. You don't choose to pay taxes the way you choose to buy groceries. The money is taken. Refusal brings consequences, penalties, seizure, imprisonment. This coercive element is what bothers people, even when they acknowledge the logic, even when they use the roads and schools and courts. The fact of being forced rankles. Voluntary systems don't work, but mandatory systems feel like violations. This tension never fully resolves. Different political philosophies answer these tensions differently. The libertarian position is blunt. Taxation is theft. Government takes your money without your consent. The fact that it provides services doesn't justify the taking. Charity should be voluntary. Services should be private. The state should be minimal. Defense, courts, basic order, and little else. The critique has power. There's something viscerally wrong about compulsion. But libertarianism struggles with public goods that markets can't provide, with externalities that individuals can't solve, with poverty that charity alone has never eliminated. The socialist perspective inverts the concern. The real theft is when the wealthy extract value from workers and hoard it. Taxes should be much higher, especially on wealth, not just income. Revenue should fund universal programs, healthcare, education, housing. Inequality itself is the injustice. The critique here matters too. But high taxes can discourage investment. Capital is mobile, it flees to lower tax jurisdictions. And history offers cautionary tales about states that promised redistribution but delivered authoritarianism. The conservative position emphasizes growth. Lower taxes leave money in private hands. Private actors spend more efficiently than governments. Cut taxes, and the economy expands, perhaps generating more total revenue even at lower rates. This logic has limits. Growth doesn't automatically benefit everyone. Public goods get underfunded. Inequality tends to increase. The progressive position argues for balance. Higher taxes on the wealthy are fair. They've benefited most from society and can afford to contribute most. Fund robust social programs. Invest in opportunity. Use the tax system to create a more just society. But progressives face hard questions too. At what rate does taxation become punishing? How do you prevent capital flight? Who decides what's enough? These aren't just academic debates. They shape elections. They determine policies. They reflect genuine disagreements about values, not just facts. Can we just look at the data and see what works? Sort of. But context complicates everything. Some high-tax countries thrive. The Nordic nations, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, collect far more in taxes than the United States. They also have excellent health outcomes, low poverty, high life satisfaction. The system works there. Would it work everywhere? Probably not. The Nordic countries have small, homogeneous populations, high social trust, strong institutions built over generations, a culture of compliance. You can't just import their tax code and expect the same results. Low-tax jurisdictions sometimes thrive too. Singapore and Hong Kong have minimal taxation but impressive economic outcomes. Though they're city-states with unique circumstances, ports, strategic locations, specific populations, and low-tax systems often have hidden costs. Limited social safety nets, greater inequality, reliance on cheap labor or resource extraction. The honest answer: optimal tax levels depend on what you're trying to achieve, what your society looks like, what institutions exist to implement policy. Sweden's system wouldn't work in Somalia. America's system wouldn't work in Sweden. One size doesn't fit all. The search for the perfect tax rate is probably futile. Beneath the policy debates lies a deeper tension. Is it wrong to take someone's earned income? If you worked for that money, produced value, earned it fairly, what right does anyone have to claim a portion? But also, is it wrong to let people suffer when you could help? If taxation funds food for hungry children, medicine for the sick, shelter for the homeless, isn't there a moral obligation to contribute? Both positions have weight. Individual rights matter. The fruits of your labor are, in some meaningful sense, yours. Forced redistribution, taken too far, undermines the incentives that create prosperity in the first place. But collective responsibility matters too. No one succeeds alone. Your wealth depends on infrastructure, education, legal systems, social stability, all things others helped create. Contribution to the common good isn't just extraction, it's reciprocity. This tension is fundamental. It probably can't be resolved philosophically. Reasonable people disagree about where to draw lines. Democracy tries to navigate by letting people vote. The balance shifts with elections, with generational changes, with economic conditions. It's messy, it's frustrating. It may be the best we can do. Regardless of philosophy, one thing is clear: governments need money. Modern states provide services that require revenue: defense, healthcare, education, infrastructure, courts, regulation. None of it is free. You can argue about how much. You can debate what should be public versus private. You can propose reforms, cuts, expansions, but some level of taxation is unavoidable for any functioning state. The alternative isn't freedom, it's failed states, where roads crumble and contracts can't be enforced and security becomes privatized for whoever can afford it. The question isn't whether to tax, it's how and how much. And there's no perfect answer. Every system makes trade-offs. Every choice has costs. Given all this philosophy, why do people still hate taxes? Because it's their money. The cost is immediate and visible. You see the deduction on your paycheck. You write the check to the IRS. The pain is concentrated and personal. The benefits are diffuse and delayed. You don't notice the road that doesn't have potholes. You don't appreciate the disease outbreak that didn't happen. The gains are invisible precisely because the system works, and government waste is infuriating. Everyone can point to some program, some expenditure, some bureaucratic absurdity that seems to mock their contribution. No one likes feeling forced. Even when the logic is sound, even when the benefits are real, the coercion grates. This is human nature. It's probably not going to change. Here's the fundamental contradiction of democratic life. We want services, but resist paying for them. We want low taxes, but also good roads, quality schools, secure borders, clean water, safe food, functioning courts. We want someone else to pay. Politicians exploit this endlessly, promise more services and lower taxes, attack opponents for wanting to cut beloved programs and for wanting to raise taxes. The contradiction is electoral gold. And we're all complicit. We vote for impossible promises. We complain about taxes while using everything they fund. We want the benefits of collective action without the costs. This tension is baked into democracy. It's probably not solvable, only manageable. Every generation negotiates anew. Balances shift. Priorities change. But the fundamental bargain remains. We're in this together, whether we like it or not. So after 5,000 years of taxation, where does that leave us? With no final answers, with ongoing debates, with systems that are compromises, imperfect and contested. With taxes, in other words, same as it ever was. In our final segment, we'll step back and reflect on this entire journey, from Sumerian grain to digital cryptocurrency, from Pharaoh's share to your paycheck deductions. What has taxation taught us about human nature, about civilization, about the eternal struggle between individual and collective? That reflection comes next. We've traveled a long way together tonight, from the mud-brick temples of ancient Sumer to the gleaming towers of modern finance. From grain counted by cuneiform scribes to cryptocurrency tracked by blockchain algorithms. 5,000 years of taxation, 5,000 years of grumbling about it. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. Taxes have funded civilization's greatest achievements. The irrigation canals that made Mesopotamia bloom, the roads that connected Rome's vast empire, the universities and hospitals and research laboratories that extended human life and expanded human knowledge. Taxes also funded civilization's worst atrocities. Armies that conquered and enslaved, secret police that terrorized, wars that consumed generations. The same power that builds also destroys. The revenue that creates prosperity can also enable oppression. Taxes are a tool. What they accomplish depends on who wields them and how. Empires rose on tax revenue, and when the taxes became unbearable, those same empires fell. Rome's collapse, The French Revolution. American independence. The pattern repeats across centuries and continents. Build, extract, overreach, collapse. Begin again. Some things remain constant across all those millennia. People have always resented paying taxes. The Sumerian farmer hiding grain from the temple assessor, the Roman peasant fleeing to barbarian lands, the American colonist dumping tea into Boston Harbor, you sighing at your tax bill. Same frustration, different eras. Authorities have always needed revenue. There is no government without funding, no roads without someone paying for them, no armies without soldiers who expect compensation. The tension is fundamental to organized society itself. Tax collectors have never been popular. From the publicani of Rome to the modern auditor, the person who takes your money is never beloved. It's perhaps the world's oldest unpopular job, and tax evasion is as old as taxes themselves. Where there are levies, there are people trying to avoid them. Hidden grain, unreported income, offshore accounts. The methods evolve. The impulse persists. Human nature doesn't change. We want the benefits of collective action without bearing the individual costs. This tension is eternal, but the scale has transformed beyond recognition. Modern states collect far more than ancient kingdoms ever imagined. Revenues that would have seemed like fantasy to pharaohs or emperors. Trillions of dollars flowing through government accounts. The complexity has exploded. Nobody, literally nobody, understands the full tax code of any major nation. It would take years just to read it. The rules multiply faster than anyone can track. Governments have become vastly more efficient at collecting. Electronic records, bank reporting, employer withholding. The cash economy shrinks. The traceable economy expands. Hiding income grows ever harder. The justification has shifted too. Ancient kings taxed by divine right. They took because they could, because the gods had placed them in power. Modern democracies claim a different legitimacy. The social contract. You vote for representatives. They set tax policy. You consent, at least in theory, to the system that governs you. And expectations have grown. Medieval peasants expected little from their lords beyond not being actively murdered. Modern citizens expect roads, schools, healthcare, retirement security, environmental protection, and countless other services. We demand more. We receive more. We pay more. Everything has scaled up together. Let's talk about what you actually pay. Between federal income tax, state income tax, local taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, payroll taxes for Social Security, and Medicare, the average American pays somewhere between 25 and 35% of their income in taxes. It varies enormously by state, by income level, by personal circumstances. Europeans often pay 40 to 50%. Scandinavians, as we discussed, even more. This sounds high, and it is high. A substantial portion of your working life goes to fund collective purposes rather than your individual choices. But compare it to medieval peasants who might have owed 60 to 70% of their harvest to various lords, churches, and authorities. Of course, medieval peasants didn't have student loans or health insurance premiums or childcare costs. So perhaps it's not a straightforward comparison. Still, perspective helps. Your tax burden is real, but it's not unprecedented. Where does the money go? The roads you drive on. Maintained, repaired, occasionally improved. Somebody has to pay for that asphalt. Schools that educate children, yours or your neighbors. Teachers who show up every day. Books and buildings and buses. Police and fire services. The people who come when you call 911. The firefighters who don't ask for a credit card before extinguishing flames. Military protection. Whatever you think of particular wars, the basic function of national defense costs money. In America, Social Security providing retirement income, Medicare covering healthcare for the elderly. In Britain, the NHS treating everyone regardless of ability to pay. Courts that settle disputes, parks where children play, libraries still free, still there. Food safety inspections, air traffic control, weather forecasting, all the boring, essential stuff that makes modern life possible. You could argue any particular expenditure is wasteful. You could almost certainly find examples of money poorly spent. But the overall package, the infrastructure of civilization, that's what taxes buy. Here's some perspective for the next time you're annoyed about taxes. You're probably not being beaten for late payment. That was common in ancient times. Tax collectors with clubs and soldiers at their backs. You probably won't be imprisoned for inability to pay. Debtors' prisons existed well into the modern era. Charles Dickens's father was imprisoned for debt. You can vote for the representatives who set tax policy. Not perfectly, the system has flaws, but your voice exists. Ancient peasants had no such voice. You can legally contest assessments you believe are wrong. There are procedures, appeals, courts. You're not simply at the mercy of whoever shows up to collect. Tax rates are published and theoretically predictable. You can plan, you can calculate, no arbitrary demands appearing without warning. You are not a medieval peasant. That's worth something. Yes, taxes are annoying, genuinely annoying. Nobody enjoys writing that check or seeing that withholding. Yes, governments waste money. Every government, everywhere, always has. Inefficiency is inherent to large organizations. It's frustrating, but it's not unique to our time. Yes, you could probably spend your money better yourself. At least, you'd spend it on things you personally value. That's the eternal argument against taxation. Individual choice versus collective decision. But also, civilization requires collective resources. Roads don't build themselves. Schools don't run on goodwill. Militaries don't volunteer. Pure individualism, everyone keeping everything, contributing nothing, gives you failed states, chaos, the absence of the predictability that makes modern life possible. The tax-funded world, for all its frustrations, is better than the alternative. We know this because we can see the alternative. Places where governments can't collect taxes don't have functioning societies. That doesn't mean every tax is good, every rate is fair, every expenditure is wise, but it means the fundamental bargain, we all contribute, we all benefit, is worth preserving. People will always complain about taxes. It's practically patriotic in many countries, especially America. We started with a tax revolt, after all. Grumbling about government taking our money is a national tradition, but we keep paying. Because we like roads, we like knowing someone will come if we call for help. We like not being invaded by hostile neighbors. The complaining and the paying coexist, have coexisted for 5,000 years, will coexist for as long as humans organize themselves into societies. That's just who we are. Taxes are the price of civilization. Sometimes that price feels too high. Sometimes you look at what you paid and what you received, and the math doesn't seem to work. But 5,000 years of human history shows us the alternative. No taxes means no lasting civilization, no great works, no shared infrastructure, no collective achievements. So we grumble, and we pay, and we argue about it, and we vote for people who promise to lower them or raise them on someone else. Just like every generation before us, just like every generation after us will. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you can rest easy. At least you're not a Sumerian farmer, lying awake worrying whether the temple assessor will take too much of your barley, or a Roman peasant, hiding from the publicani who might beat you if you can't pay, or a medieval serf owing half your crops to the Lord and a tenth to the church, and wondering how your children will survive the winter. Your taxes might be complicated, annoying, sometimes seemingly inexplicable. But hey, you have indoor plumbing, antibiotics, a device in your pocket with access to all human knowledge. Thank you, tax dollars. Sort of. Sleep well. Dream of simpler tax codes. And remember, you come by your complaints honestly. Your ancestors were grumbling 5,000 years ago. Some traditions are worth keeping. Now, I'll admit, 5,000 years of taxation might not be the most soothing bedtime journey, but there's something strangely comforting in knowing that people have been grumbling about their tax obligations since the first scribe pressed reed to clay. Some things truly never change. But let's shift now from what governments take to what banks lend. From obligations owed upward to debts stretched across decades. Because if taxes represent our duty to the collective, mortgages represent something more personal, the dream of a place to call your own, and the long winding path to actually owning it. Let's explore when mortgages became common and how borrowing against tomorrow became the way we build our lives today.